prepared for that because I thought he would do that. So I think what we should do in this meeting is open the agenda, and I'll ask if any of you have comments or information. We do want to talk about the letter from OAC giving the funding to pretrial services, which is obviously an excellent thing, and we'll hear from Kelsey and Alan on that. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to add to the agenda or raise for discussion?
Nothing really to add on my part, but I did, Jill, I know it's pretty short notice, but I just sent you the statistics I've compiled over the last, since January of this year. I think you should have just gotten those.
Yeah, I just forwarded it to everyone, so it should be in everyone's inbox.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so that kind of summarizes how we, because it was brought up last meeting that it'd be nice to see some comparison month over month. So Stephanie kind of gave me some suggestions of what I should include on this. So I included what I have here, but I also think I might expand it a little bit to maybe, I think it was, it might have been Stephen or Peter that brought up, it'd be nice to see, the question's always raised of how do you measure success? And so if I could put success and failure rates to be totally transparent, I think I'm going to start doing that too. And that'd be calculating, like, success, would be guilty pleas or deferred or charge dismissed, things like that. And then the failures that really we only would be tracking are failure to appears to court and removal from pretrial services. So once I can run those reports and hopefully they look accurate based off of my experience with the cases, then I'll start including those on this spreadsheet as well.
That would be great, Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes.
Alan, could you again say what you're going to consider a failure?
Well, currently the only failure would be a failure to appear for court and a warrant was issued. So failing to appear to court by itself would not constitute in the success and failure of pretrial services. It would have to have the warrant issued so we could remove them from pretrial services.
It
So
looks like the
that would be-
department. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that would be a warrant for a new crime or failure to appear or fleeing or what?
It would be a warrant on the case that was currently in pretrial and we were monitoring. So if they have, let's say a person has 3 pending felonies, but we are only monitoring 1 of those, then if they got a warrant in that one case, we would mark that as a failure. But if they were to get warrants in the other 2 cases that we're not technically supervising them on, we are giving them court dates and helping them keep those things in order, but we're not officially directed by the court to monitor on those cases. If they were to pick up warrants on those, we don't count those as failures.
Given the purposes of pretrial release, I wonder why a charge of a new crime would not be a failure also.
That's things that I think we could discuss that could be brought up in this group, or just generally start thinking about that. I think when we were talking about it last month, it might have been 2 months ago now, that was mentioned as that could be a failure of pretrial conditions if they're failing to comply with the orders that says they are to maintain law-abiding behavior. That could be considered a failure. But right now, all I have the metric to really track is the failure to appear. If we start inputting data into CE, which is our software system that we use, if we start inputting data saying that they picked up a new charge and we count that as a violation, we may potentially be able to start tracking those as failure rates too. So that's a good point, Stephen.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Carol, did you have a comment?
I guess as this conversation continues, I might need a refresher on exactly what we mean by failure and what is the significance of that versus what we mean by violation. And like, are we talking about when somebody would then be removed from pretrial services, or are we talking about how we track how effective pretrial services tends to be for defendants, or are we talking like I'm a little confused about what the significance of failure means. And then I would have all the questions that Stephen just had about what we might consider to be a failure and how we track that.
Yeah, and I would agree with that completely, Carol, that I think we need to define as a group what we would consider a failure. So if a failure to one person is somebody picking up a new alleged offense, then we should start tracking that. But if somebody says, well, if they're still complying with all the other orders of the court and they're showing up to court and they're staying in contact with their attorney and they're doing all the things they need to for this case, is it really a failure? So I think once we can define what a failure is versus a violation, I would consider a violation to be more of a technical violation with us, failing to call into our office or report to our office as directed, if depending on what level they are, failure to check in, things like that. I would consider those more violations than a failure.
I agree. And but it does seem to me that committing a new crime is pretty clearly a failure. And unless things have changed since I was on the bench, the standard order is that the person remain a law-abiding citizen. I've always kind of wondered about that expression, but basically to be a law-abiding citizen, you have to abide by the law, which means that being accused of a new crime is a failure. I mean, that seems pretty fundamental to me, actually, that that a new crime be considered a failure. We could talk about whether that would apply to any new crime or a felony crime or a violent crime or what, but it does seem like committing a crime is at least as much a failure as not showing up for a hearing. I don't know. What are other people's views on that? Anybody?
It looks like Carol and Stephen have their hands raised.
Okay, go for it. Carol, why don't you go first?
Then I guess I'm just still wanting to know, what does it mean when we say that somebody has had a failure? What is the significance of that?
I don't think we've defined that yet. And I think it was Peter who brought that up last month. And that's I think we need to sit down, maybe Stephanie, this group, Judge Jones, need to sit down and we need to determine what we would consider a failure. And then on that same note, it came up last time in conversation too, of how do you track success? So if somebody calls in or I call them and say, hey, just so you know, you have court tomorrow. And they say, oh, thank you so much. I completely forgot about that. You saved me. I don't have a metric to count that. I don't have any spreadsheet I can put that in. I don't have like near saves that I can count that as a success. But it's still there. It's just it's harder to actually tangibly see.
Anecdotally, do you see a lot of that?
Yes. Yeah, we do.
Good.
And we've also made phone calls the morning of, just to, hey, as a reminder, you know, we know this person might have trouble remembering this date, and they'll say, hey, I'm running a little bit late, and I've gone to the arraignment calendar, you know, thrown on my jacket, gone to the arraignment calendar and spoken with a public defender or whoever's there and said, hey, just so you know, I had contact with Mr. Such and such, and he's going to be 10 minutes late. Please don't give him a warrant. And they thank me, and he usually shows up, and so that saves them in that way too.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, that's what I've envisioned pretrial services doing, is helping people and maintaining a human contact with them, like a phone call,
Yeah,
as opposed to a text. That's great. Good. Stephen, did you have a comment?
I do. Allow me to insert a little institutional memory here. All of these pretrial releases are based on the pretrial risk assessment. And the risk was assessing the risk of failure to appear or committing a new violent crime.
Can I interrupt you for a minute, Stephen?
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's risk of committing a new violent crime? I think it might be just risk of committing a new crime. I'm just saying that off the top of my head. I haven't looked at my notes.
Well, I think that's what the PSA did, and I thought we tweaked it to a new violent crime, but
No, I think, I had the same thought you did, but I think that what we tweaked was not what the future risk was. I think that on the PSA, we tweaked it so that we were looking at past violent crimes in order to assess a person's level of risk. I'm sorry. Why don't you go ahead with your comment and we can figure out whose memory is accurate later.
and I have no assurance that my memory is accurate.
And nor do
But-
I, so.
But
Yeah.
all I'm saying is that I think there are two perspectives on this that we should hold in front of us. One is the ability to evaluate the decisions that are made based on the risk assessment. And so I think this definition is really important and should be as tight as we can make it, so we can tell whether a particular release turns out to be appropriate in real life, as opposed to the metric of the scoring mechanism. And number two, I still have seared into my brain the concern during the implementation plan ordinance initiative last year, the concern of the public to release as many people as possible, but at the highest level of public safety as possible. So I think we need to get a handle on new crimes, because if we're releasing a lot of people who commit a lot of new crimes, I think in the public facing sense of this, not amongst us professionals within the court system, we want to know that, and we want to be able to either adjust for that or justify those releases. So
I
think
agree.
that's a really important question.
Yes, I agree. Is there anybody here who wants to give a different view, that we should either not count new crimes or not count certain types of new crimes when we define failure? I don't hear any comment. Carol, you got a comment? Carol?
Yeah, sorry. One of the things that I have really appreciated about the PSA tool, and I think that we've affirmed a few times in our discussions in this work group, is the ability to kind of differentiate tracking of different kinds of risks. And so I believe the Arnold tool separates out risk of failure to appear, risk of new criminal activity, and risk of new violent criminal activity. And to me, it seems like especially if the tool is designed to assess those risks separately, and if we can track outcomes separately for those risks, that all feels to me like helpful information to be able to get an idea of what's working well and what's not working well, and how well our assessment of risk is matching what actually happens, or how well we can match support services needed to the different risks. So I like using the tool as well as we can to continue to assess and track all three of those categories, if the rest of the committee agrees.
That makes very good sense to me. I don't know, Jake, we haven't heard from you. What's your view about all of this?
I guess it really kind of depends on what the end goal is. If it's to show up, resolve cases in a timely fashion, maintain contact, make sure that happens. I know with down here with misdemeanors and the courts we work with, they're very heavily involved in some different avenues for compliance, substance testing and bracelets and those type of things. So it's just a little bit different. I don't want to muddy the waters just because our systems are set up a little bit different. You know, we don't use the PSA because, you know, when we were looking into it, it would need to happen like it would in Superior Court, where the judges make it's prepared in advance and they make that determination. They look at those things. Again, in our court and the courts we work with, the judges just make that decision and then they come to us. So it's just a little bit different. So I hesitate to share too much to make it more complicated than it needs to be, I guess.
I understand. Thank you, though. Stephanie, haven't asked you, do you have any views or anything you'd like to share?
I mean, I guess I do think it is important for us to consider what is it that we're hoping, like, what is it that we want to know at the end about success? And though that's a good place to start, those 3 areas, just in terms of kind of kicking off this idea of what success looks like in pretrial, within the context of what our pretrial program is doing. So we're encouraging and hopefully connecting people who are willing to services. We're providing bus passes for transportation. We're providing check-ins, reminder calls, that kind of contact. But there's not, like, as Jake mentioned, it's different than kind of how district court is doing it. So we're looking at, we really need to define what we think success looks like.
And I guess my question is for both Stephanie and Alan, in terms of record keeping, particularly if we were to keep records that subdivide the term failure into failure to appear, committing a violent crime, and committing a crime, what would that entail in terms of keeping those statistics in a form that we can analyze later?
So I can enter those. It might be more difficult to enter violent crime versus just new offense. I'll look into that. But we do have spots in CE in our software to track how they were removed. So failure or success. And that's easy. You can just put in the notes, failed to appear, or I can put in the notes for. I'm thinking out loud. I'm sorry. I'm trying to follow my train of thought here. So yes, we can easily track failure to appears because those would be removed from the system if they were on a supervised case with us, and it would be removed as unsuccessful, failed to appear, warrant issued. The other one where we're tracking crimes versus, or new criminal activity versus new violent criminal activity, that one I'll have to look into. I know we can track criminal activity, but I don't know if it gets so specific to be new violent criminal activity without me pulling the report and then going through every single case to see what crime was committed and then using that against my spreadsheet to see which one's a violent crime. That one would be much more labor intensive, and I'm hesitant to do something like that if I can have CE do it for me. So I'll look into that.
That would be great. It would be nice. I mean, in any event, it seems to me we ought to be tracking new crimes, and if we can subdivide, all the better. But at the very least, we can. Well, let's make a decision as a group. I think we've sort of tacitly made it. Do we consider failure to include new crimes, being accused of another crime? Is there anybody who would vote against that? Do we all agree that that should be included as part of failure?
I am hesitant to include it as part of failure per se, but I think it's something that we need to track. So I don't know if we need to necessarily put a label on it as a failure. Obviously, it's not a success. And if it's not a success, does that mean it necessarily has to be a failure? I don't think so. So I think if we just track the statistic and then we can maybe label it, if we want to label it later as a failure, we can if we decide that as a group. But I think step one is just me starting to enter that information into CE and then pull that report and then start tracking those numbers.
Yeah, I agree, really. It would be good to have some sort of individual assessment of as to whether somebody should be removed from pretrial services and considered a failure, depending on what the crime is. And obviously an assault is going to be looked at differently than a shoplifting offense. Yeah. So I think Alan's proposed resolution is a good one. How that translates to how we define failure is another question, I guess, because obviously a failure is a failure to appear to the extent that a warrant is issued. That's a pretty black and white scenario.
Yeah.
Commission of a new crime. What I would favor is commission of a new crime if there's been a decision, I would think by a judge, that the commission of the new crime warrants removal from pretrial services. Now, obviously, that would require some action by the prosecutor to bring that issue before the judge.
Yeah, so I know, Stephen, I know you have your hand up, I'm sorry. So if somebody were to commit a new crime, for instance, just to kind of let everybody know of our process once more, is that if somebody were to be alleged of committing a new crime, we would fill out a notice of alleged violation report with their name, their case number. We'd say on this date and time, said individual committed this alleged offense, and then we send it to a commissioner right now for a signature. And recently they've been checking a box that that says something along the lines, I'll paraphrase a little bit, is that pretrial is to forward this to defense and defense and prosecuting attorney for further decision. And then we file that, we put that in their file, we give that to the court clerk, and we send one to the prosecutor and the defense. So that's our process if somebody commits a new alleged offense. Then it kind of is in the prosecutor's court. You know, what do they want to do? They have this information now that somebody allegedly committed a new crime, and it's up to them.
That seems appropriate to me.
Yeah, and that's the policy. That's what we've been doing since the beginning.
That's why I would argue that we should not be shy about labeling something a failure, because that's not the end of the analysis. The judicial officer is going to make an appropriate adjustment to the person's status. And a failure also from where we started out with this work group and the PSA, we have expanded our intention to intervene on behalf of these people that we let out into the community. You know, for a while we had very flat monitoring where it was just text messages, and then sometimes in-person check-ins or phone check-ins. You know, we still don't have a lot of GPS tracking, for instance. We're trying to make referrals. I don't know if you know, if somebody is referred for substance use treatment or a substance use evaluation and they comply with that, but because they still are bearing the brunt of their addiction, they shoplift a loaf of bread, they might have a new crime, but they've followed through. You know, it's not exactly their fault that they're still addicted. If they commit armed robbery because of their addiction, I think, there are lots of nuances. If they don't follow through on their evaluation or they don't comply with treatment, that's a whole set of different factors. All of those I think we could call failures, but we would respond differently to them. But we want to know that this referral, this release didn't work out the way we hoped it had, or the interventions that we had weren't sufficient to address this person's need. And I don't think we can assess that unless we label that outcome a failure and look at what happened that prompted the failure. I don't know if that makes sense to other people, but I think this is a pretty nuanced question that we want to know from a systematic response kind of perspective. whether what we're doing is effective. And we won't be able to highlight that and dig into that unless we're looking at failures.
I think it's fair. I understand. I'm tracking what you're saying, Stephen. We don't necessarily, by classifying one particular category as a failure, doesn't mean that they're a failure overall in pretrial success. So I guess I was blurring the line a little bit until you kind of laid it out there. So that makes perfect sense. You can still label it as a failure in this one category. However, the rest of their check-ins, the rest of their court appearances, the rest of their communication with their attorney, all that is going well. Well, then that part is not a failure. So then we can adjust how maybe we approach them and give them a little more care in one area versus the other.
Part of it, I think, might be the word failure. Failure to me, I see Carol thumbs up. Failure to me means, you failed at pretrial services, and it implies that you're done with pretrial services. And I think what Stephen's saying is absolutely right. There's failures and there's failures. It's a pretty nuanced discussion. Maybe we need a new name, like, I don't know, incomplete compliance or something like that, that would include, well, I was going to say it would be everything from not meeting some aspect of pretrial conditions to total failure. Or I don't know, maybe total failure means you're out of the pretrial system, which means you're probably in jail, right? Do you see what I'm saying, though? Incomplete compliance, I don't like that name because it sounds really bureaucratic. But I think maybe failure, with its implication that now you're done, isn't the word we want to use. I don't know. Carol, what do you think? And you've got your hand up anyway.
Very much what you just said, Judge Jagera. I think that we're spinning around trying to define words that we don't know the significance of yet. And so whether we talk about failure or we talk about violations, if we're looking at people who are not coming to court or committing new crimes or committing new violent crimes, those are all things the court has told them not to do. So doing those things could be called violations also. My concern would be that we track those things. We're using a tool that is trying to define, like, what is someone's risk of doing things in these three categories. I'd like to know how we assess that risk, and then how that person's behavior does or does not line up with what that risk assessment was. And I'd like some way of measuring, like, what kinds of pretrial services and interventions are being provided, and the people who get those things, how many of those are being able to comply with court conditions, and how many people are violating court conditions. Like, it just seems like we need ways of measuring how well it's going. And the more we can track those things, the better. But we should start by being really clear, if we're using a word like failure, or we're using other words, what exactly do we mean by what constitutes a failure, and then what is the significance of a failure? Or let's use other words if that one's not helping.
Absolutely. I think
agree with Carol, that all of these are violations, and why don't we just call them that? Because they're going to be assessed. The consequences of them are going to be assessed. They're going to be changes or not. Higher levels of monitoring, back into jail, whatever, new referrals, but they're all violations, and that triggers, that indicates that what we first set out to do didn't work. And secondly, it triggers a reevaluation. I don't see why we need to be more pejorative than just the factual statement that they violated what the order was. But
in fact, I agree with you about the wording. Let's not call it a failure unless we're sure, because that is a pretty pejorative thing. We do need to track the types of violations, at least into 2 and hopefully 3 categories, the, missing court with a warrant, and the 2 types of new crimes. But if we call all of them violations, it seems like the system is set up for the more serious violations to come before the court for an assessment, because the prosecutor would be bringing that in the event of a serious violation. And so there's a way for the court to look at a violation and term it a failure and terminate pretrial services for that person if that's appropriate. But I think we don't want to call it a failure unless the court has determined that it's a failure. And we should call them violations unless and until we get to that point. I think I've probably just reiterated what the rest of you said, but does everybody agree on that? It makes good sense to me.
Yeah, I like that.
So Carol, you wanted to redefine or reassess and define the term failure, but we've ended up doing away with it, which is probably just as well. Yeah. Okay. Any more on this discussion? I'm going to relay all this to Judge Jones, by the way, so he's up to speed by the time we talk about all this again. All right.
I would just try to urge that if at all possible, we try to gather both new crimes and new violent crimes. And I understand that may be a workload issue for Alan and Kelsey, but if it is, then we ought to try to get them more resources to be able to do that, because I think that's a meaningful distinction for understanding how well we're handling pretrial releases.
Alan, can you report back to us next month on what you find in the way of your ability to record those statistics and pull them?
Yeah, I can look into that and I'll let you know.
Just making a note here. Okay. Are we ready to move on to the next topic? I just, hearing no objection, I just wanted to congratulate Stephanie and Alan, and if he were here, Judge Jones, on the funding from OAC that was described in Judge Jones's email to us, and it was enclosed with it. It's not a huge grant, but $50,000 is always welcome. And it seems like it's focused on some of the true administrative costs that often don't get hardly considered. Are you, Stephanie and Alan, are you pretty happy with this?
I'm excited. I think that the other thing it comes with is support from AOC looking at kind of best practices. So I think that that's also helpful to have some more perspective from them.
Yes.
But it's exciting. There was a lot of competition, it sounds like. So it's nice that they felt that our proposal was worth investing in.
Yes, I agree. Good work. Alan, you're pleased?
Yeah, like Stephanie said, I think it'll be really good for us. And the things, just like it proposed in the letter, the things that they're that Stephanie proposed and worded to them that Judge Jones has been curious about is, maybe expanding into other programming and having more actual goods for clients that come in the office, and so I think it'll be really good for us. And then having the backing of the AOC or of the courts on best practices is going to be great.
Yeah, I agree. And their consulting services can be pretty valuable to us.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Stephanie, I don't recall receiving what your specific proposal was. If you distributed it, let me know and I'll dig around in my folders. But if you didn't, that would have the details, because the letter was sort of general about what it was covering. And So I'd like to know what the plan of action is, you know, out of your office. And
I can provide that for everyone to look at. I can send it to Jill to send around. It wasn't sent around before.
okay,
Our plan, and this is the first letter, so we have to meet with them to talk about contracting and timelines for some of it. And AOC, many of their contracts are broad enough that we can take an award amount within the categories we proposed and kind of adjust amounts. But I don't know what this one will look like. So it may also be that they tie it in specifically to what was proposed. I'm hoping that they'll schedule a meeting within the next few weeks that we'll have more idea of what that looks like.
thank you for routing that around. And I for one would just be, I'm not interested in interfering or getting into the weeds in a way that impedes your work plan on this, but I would like to know how you're deciding to allocate that money.
I'm hoping that we'll have more information next month when we meet from AOC.
Good. Good. That finishes the topics that I had for discussion today. Does anyone have anything else that they'd like to raise? And
Nothing
let's
very
see,
well.
Judge
I
Garrett,
note, what did you say, Stephen?
unfortunately, Maya's not here, but she sent around that article on the Denver Competency Court and you know, since the Competency Restoration Work Group is sort of dispersing a little bit or parceling out some of that attention to other committees, because Perry's stepping back from full-time work. That interests me. I don't know if it falls in the pretrial processes scope of work and we're still talking about whether it's in legal and justice or behavioral health or both, but I'd be interested in hearing Maya talk about or us talk about that idea. I don't think we
would
can
be-
do that today without her.
I would be too. I didn't get Maya's email, so I don't have this article. Jill, do you have it?
I don't recall seeing anything recently from her, but I will check in with her and find out.
That's good
Okay.
of you. And if you get it from her, could you then send it around to the rest of us?
Yes.
Maybe
Thank
she
you.
intended it for the Competency Restoration Work Group and I'm just getting my wires and work groups.
Could be, but either way, it sounds interesting. And, you know, the worst that'll happen will be we read it and decide that that's more for the other work group than for us. But I'd still like to see it. That's an ongoing issue for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Jill, for once I note that, we don't have an opportunity for public comment. I say for once I note because I often forget this when I chair meetings. But today I'm not forgetting that there should be an opportunity for public comment. However, I see that the conference room, the council conference room that the public would be in is empty. There's nobody in there. And I don't believe we have any of the members of the public with us in our Zoom call, do we?
You're correct. We don't have any attendees today.
All right, so there has been an opportunity for public comment, but there has been no public comment. Do we have other issues before us today? All right, well, our next meeting then will be the first Friday in September.
September 6th.
September 6th. Okay, is that 7th, 8th, 9th? So that's the Friday after the Labor Day weekend, right?
Yes, it's the Friday of that week.
Yeah, okay. I do have one other thing to say, and that's I just want to thank you, Alan, for the statistics that you just sent us right at the beginning of the meeting. I haven't had time to look at them in detail, but I'm quite encouraged to see that the caseload of the pretrial services unit is consistently rising, and so is the use of the PSA tool. It seems good. We'll all review those statistics and we can talk further about them next month.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I do also like the upward trend.
Good. Well, that's what we want to see. So I'm glad we're seeing it. Good. Thanks to all of you for taking your time this sunny August afternoon to have this meeting, and I'll look forward to seeing you all on Friday, September 6th. And that finishes our meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.